Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater. This book is in the public domain. Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. This is the second of a 4-part read on the very interesting topic of second sight, better known as clairvoyance. In this video, the author will discuss the various types or grades of clairvoyance. I am curious, do you have any level of clairvoyance? Or have you had a clairvoyant experience? Please do leave a comment and share. Yes, inquiring minds would like to know. I will share with you a couple odd experiences which I've had. These may fall under his category, especially since he's going to discuss the various grades of clairvoyance, and this one I think he would group under dreams. So when I was around 8 years old, maybe definitely under the age of 10, I dreamt that my father fell in a tunnel and no one would help him out. And after much cry for help, I approached the tunnel and saw that my dad was in a predicament. I called my mother, and soon after my brothers also joined and we helped him out. So I shared this dream with my mother. I was a little girl and she didn't make much of it. And then years later, my mom recalled the dream and she was telling me about it. And I says, yeah, I do remember that dream. And then she was telling me how they, as a couple and as a family, that we struggled, and that my dad had gone through many hardships and he was going through some life crisis, physical and financial. And outside of the nucleus, our nucleus, it seemed as if the world had turned away from him. And in the end, it was all about family. And then years later, when I was, I don't know, maybe 12 years old, I had a dream that my grandmother on my mother's side came to get me. I was sleeping and she came to get me. She was dressed in white and she had this beautiful glow about her. I didn't think it was odd that she was floating in the air. Well, whether I had an out-of-body experience or I dreamt it, I don't know. That part is a little vague, but I do remember that I was floating and I could see that I was above our house and I could see outside. We were outside literally floating and I could see through the roof. I could see my brothers and I could see my mother and my father sleeping. Grandma reached out and she reached her hand and simply asked, "Are you ready? We need to go." I paused and I told her, "Grandma, I'm not ready to go." Next I know, it was time to get up as any normal morning and get ready for school. And before I left to take the bus, I told my mom of this dream. That same day when I came home from school, there was this long face. Everybody had a long face, and the news was that Grandma was in a coma. And after several days, Grandma did snap out of the coma, and Mom, months later, told Grandma about this dream that I had, at which time Grandma, being that we're from the Caribbean islands, so we have these old ways still, and she asked me to get on my knees, get right up in front of her. She put her hand on my crown, on my head, and said, "We break the pact. You will live a beautiful life." Well, the thing is that when I was a little girl, like my first few formative years, when I was a baby till the age of 5, I grew up with my grandparents in the Caribbean island with both sets of grandparents. I would spend 1 week with one and then the other week with the other. And that happened because my parents were a young couple and they were going through hardships when they were here in the United States. And I would ask my grandmother, on my mother's side, I would say, "When it's your time to go, you make sure that you come and get me. You take me with you." Well, odd thing, it did happen. So I have a couple other odd ones, but I'll save that for another day. I know that you're interested in what the author has to say. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the page. Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater. This book is in the public domain. Simple clairvoyance, partial. The experience of the untrained clairvoyant, and be it remembered that the class includes all European clairvoyants except a very few, will however usually fall very far short of what I have attempted to indicate. They will fall short in many different ways, in degree, in variety, or in permanence, and above all, in precision. Sometimes, for example, a man's clairvoyance will be permanent, but very partial, extending only perhaps to 1 or 2 classes of the phenomena observable. He will find himself endowed with some isolated fragment of higher vision, without apparently possessing other powers of sight which ought normally to accompany that fragment, or even to precede it. For example, one of my dearest friends has all his life had the power to see the atomic ether and atomic astral matter, and to recognize their structure, alike in darkness or in light, as in interpenetrating everything else. Yet he has only rarely seen entities whose bodies are composed of the much more obvious lower ethers or denser astral matter, and at any rate is certainly not permanently able to see them. He simply finds himself in possession of this special faculty, without any apparent reason to account for it, or any recognizable relation to anything else. And beyond proving to him the existence of these atomic planes and demonstrating their arrangement, it is difficult to see of what particular use it is to him at present. Still, there the thing is, and it is an earnest of greater things to come, of further power still awaiting development. There are many similar cases. Similar, I mean, not in the possession of that particular form of sight, which is unique in my experience, but in showing the development of some one small part of the full and clear vision of the astral and etheric planes. In 9 cases out of 10, however, such partial clairvoyance will at the same time lack precision also. That it is to say, there will be a good deal of vague impression and inference about it, instead of the clear-cut definition and certainly of the trained man. Examples of this type are constantly to be found, especially among those who advertise themselves as test and business clairvoyants. Then again, there are those who are only temporarily clairvoyant under certain special conditions. Among these are various subdivisions, some being able to reproduce the state of clairvoyance at will by, again, setting up the same conditions, while with others it comes sporadically, without any observable reference to their surroundings, and with yet others the powers show itself only once or twice in the whole course of their lives. To the first of these subdivisions belong those who are clairvoyant only when in the mesmeric trance, who when not so entranced are incapable of seeing or hearing anything abnormal. These may sometimes reach great heights of knowledge and be exceedingly precise in their indications, but when that is so they are usually undergoing a course of regular training, though for some reason unable as yet to set themselves free from the leaden weight of earthly life without assistance. In the same class we may put those chiefly Orientals, who gain some temporary sight under the influence of certain drugs, or by means of the performance of certain ceremonies. The ceremonialist sometimes hypnotizes himself by his repetitions, and in that condition becomes to some extent clairvoyant. More often, he simply reduces himself to a passive condition in which some other entity can obsess him to speak through him. Sometimes, again, his ceremonies are not intended to affect himself at all, but to invoke some astral entity who will give him the required information. But of course, that is a case of magic and not of clairvoyance. Both the drugs and the ceremonies are methods emphatically to be avoided by anyone who wishes to approach clairvoyance from the higher side, and to use it for his own progress and for the helping of others. The Central African medicine man or witch doctor and some of the Tartar shamans are good examples of the type. Those to whom a certain amount of clairvoyant power has come occasionally, only, and without any reference to their own wish, have often been hysterical or highly nervous persons with whom the faculty was to a large extent one of the symptoms of a disease. Its appearance showed that the physical vehicle was weakened to such a degree that it no longer presented any obstacle in the way of a certain modicum of etheric or astral vision. An extreme example of this class is the man who drinks himself into delirium tremens, and in the condition of absolute physical ruin and impure psychic excitation brought about by the ravages of that fell disease, is able to see, for the time, some of the loathsome elemental and other entities which he has drawn round himself by his long course of degraded and bestial indulgence. There are, however, other cases where the power of sight has appeared and disappeared without apparent reference to the state of the physical health. But it seems probable that even in those, if they could have been observed closely enough, some alteration in the condition of their etheric double would have been noticed. Those who have only one instance of clairvoyance to report in the whole of their lives are a difficult band to classify at all exhaustively because of the great variety of the contributory circumstances. There are many among them to whom the experience has come at some supreme moment of their lives, when it is comprehensible that there might have been a temporary exaltation of faculty which would be sufficient to account for it. In the case of another subdivision of them, the solitary case has been the seeing of the apparition most commonly of some friend or a relative at the point of death. Two possibilities are then offered for our choice, and in each of them the strong wish of the dying man is the impelling force. That force may have enabled him to materialize himself for a moment, in which case, of course, no clairvoyance was needed. Or more probably, it may have acted mesmerically upon the percipient and momentarily dulled his physical and stimulated his higher sensitiveness. In either case, the vision is the product of the emergency and is not repeated simply because the necessary conditions are not repeated. There remains, however, an irresolvable residuum of cases in which a solitary instance occurs of the exercise of undoubted clairvoyance, while yet the occasion seems to us wholly trivial and unimportant. About these we can only frame hypotheses. The governing conditions are evidently not on the physical plane, and a separate investigation of each case would be necessary before we could speak with any certainty as to its causes. In some such, it has appeared that an astral entity was endeavoring to make some communication, and was able to impress only some unimportant detail on its subject, the useful or significant part of what it had to say failing to get through into the subject's consciousness. In the investigation of the phenomena of clairvoyance, all these varied types and many others will be encountered, and a certain number of cases of mere hallucination will be almost sure to appear also, and will have to be carefully weeded out from the list of examples. The student of such a subject needs an inexhaustible fund of patience and steady perseverance, but if he goes on long enough, he will begin dimly to discern order behind the chaos, and will gradually get some idea of the great laws under which the whole evolution working. It will help him greatly in his efforts if he will adopt the order which we have just followed. That is, if he will first take the trouble to familiarize himself as thoroughly as may with the actual facts concerning the planes with which ordinary clairvoyance deals. If he will learn what there really is to be seen with astral and etheric sight, and what their respective limitations are, he will then have, as it were, a standard by which to measure the cases which he observes. Since all instances of partial sight must of necessity fit into some niche in this whole, if he has the outline of the entire scheme in his head, he will find it comparatively easy, with a little practice, to classify the instances with which he is called upon to deal. We have said nothing as yet as to the still more wonderful possibilities of clairvoyance upon the mental plane, nor indeed is it necessary that much should be said, as it is exceedingly improbable that the investigator will ever meet with any examples of it except among pupils properly trained on some of the very highest schools of occultism. For them it opens up yet another new world, vaster far than all those beneath it, a world in which all that we can imagine of utmost glory and splendor in the commonplace of existence, some account of this marvelous faculty, its ineffable bliss, its magnificent opportunities for learning and for work, is given in the 6th of our Theosophical Manuals, and to that the student may be referred. All that it has to give, all of it at least that he can assimilate, is within the reach of the trained pupil. But for the untrained clairvoyant to touch, it is hardly more than a bare possibility. It has been done in mesmeric trance, but the occurrence is of exceedingly rarity, for it needs almost superhuman qualifications in the way of lofty spiritual aspiration and absolute purity of thought and intention upon the part both of the subject and the operator. To a type of clairvoyance such as this, and still more fully to that which belongs to the plane next above it, the name of spiritual sight may reasonably be applied, And since the celestial world to which it opens our eyes lies all around us here and now, it is fit that our passing reference to it should be made under the heading of simple clairvoyance. Thought it may be necessary to allude to it again when dealing with clairvoyance in space, to which we will now pass on. End of chapter. Clairvoyance in space intentional. We have defined this as the capacity to see events or scenes removed from the seer in space and too far distant for ordinary observation. The instances of this are so numerous and so various that we shall find it desirable to attempt a somewhat more detailed classification of them. It does not much matter what particular arrangement we adopt, so long as it is comprehensive enough to include all our cases. Perhaps a convenient one will be to group them under the broad divisions of intentional and unintentional clairvoyance in space, with an intermediate class that might be described as semi-intentional, a curious title, but I will explain it later. As before, I will begin by stating what is possible along this line for the fully trained seer, and endeavoring to explain how his faculty works and under what limitations it acts. After that, we shall find ourselves in a better position to try to understand the manifold examples of partial and untrained sight. Let us then, in the first place, discuss intentional clairvoyance. It will be obvious from what has previously been said as to the power of astral vision that any one possessing it in its fullness will be able to see by its means practically anything in this world that he wishes to see. The most secret places are open to his gaze, and intervening obstacles have no existence for him because of the change in his point of view, so that if we grant him the power of moving about in the astral body, he can without difficulty go anywhere and see anything within the limits of the planet. Indeed, this is to a large extent possible to him even without the necessity of moving the astral body at all, as we shall see presently. Let us consider a little more closely the methods by which this superphysical sight may be used to observe events taking place at a distance. When, for example, a man here in England sees in minutest detail something which is happening at the same moment in India or America, how is it done? A very ingenious hypothesis has been offered to account for the phenomena. It has been suggested that every object is perpetually throwing off radiations in all directions, similar in some respects to, though infinitely finer than, rays of light, and that clairvoyance is nothing but the power to see by means of these finer radiations. Distance would, in that case, no bar to the sight. All intervening objects would be penetrable by these rays, and they would be able to cross one another to infinity in all directions without entanglement, precisely as the vibrations of ordinary light do. Now, though this is not exactly the way in which clairvoyance works, the theory is nevertheless quite true in most of its premises. Every object undoubtedly is throwing off radiations in all directions, and it is precisely in this way, though on a higher plane, that the Akashic records seem to be formed. Of them it will be necessary to say something under our next heading, so we will do no more than mention them for the moment. The phenomena of psychometry are also dependent upon these radiations, as will presently be explained. There are, however, certain practical difficulties in the way of using these etheric vibrations, for that is, of course, what they are, as the medium by means of which one may see anything taking place at a distance. Intervening objects are not entirely transparent, and as the actors in the scene which the experimenter tried to observe would probably be at least equally transparent, it is obvious that serious confusion would be quite likely a result. The additional dimension which would come into play if astral radiations were sensed instead of etheric would obviate some of the difficulties, but would on the other hand introduce some fresh complications of its own. So that for practical purposes, in endeavoring to understand clairvoyance, we may dismiss this hypothesis of radiations from our minds, and turn to the methods of seeing at a distance, which are actually at the disposal of the student. It will be found that there are five, four of them being really varieties of clairvoyance, while the fifth does not properly come under that head at all, but belongs to the domain of magic. Let us take this last one first and get it out of our way. 1. By the assistance of a nature spirit. This method does not necessarily involve the possession of any psychic faculty at all on the part of the experimenter. He need only know how to induce some denizen of the astral world to undertake the investigation for him. This may be done either by invocation or by evocation. That is to say, the operator may either persuade his astral coadjutor by prayers and offerings to give him the help he desires, or he may compel his aid by the determined exercise of a highly developed will. This method has been largely practiced in the East, where the entity employed is usually a nature spirit, and in old Atlantis, where the lords of the dark phase used a highly specialized and peculiarly venomous variety of artificial elemental for this purpose. Information is sometimes obtained in the same sort of way at the spiritualistic seance of modern days, but in that case the messenger employed is more likely to be a recently deceased human being functioning more or less freely on the astral plane. Though even here also it is sometimes an obliging nature spirit who is amusing himself by posing as somebody's departed relative. In any case, as I have said, this method is not clairvoyant at all, but magical, and it is mentioned here only in order that the reader may not become confused in the endeavor to classify cases of its use under some of the following headings. 2. By means of an astral current. This is a phrase frequently and rather loosely employed in some of our theosophical literature to cover a considerable variety of phenomena, and among others that which I wish to explain. What is really done by the student who adopts this method is not so much the setting in motion of a current in astral matter as the erection of a kind of temporary telephone through it. It is impossible here to give an exhaustive disquisition on astral physics, even had I the requisite knowledge to write it. All I need say is that it is possible to make in astral matter a definite connecting line that shall act as a telegraph wire to convey vibrations by means of which all that is going on at the other end of it may be seen. Such a line is established, be it understood, not by a direct projection through space of astral matter, but by such action upon a line, or rather many lines, of particles of that matter as will render them capable of forming a conductor for vibrations of the character required. This preliminary action can be set up in two ways, either by the transmission of energy from particle to particle until the line is formed, or by the use of a force from a higher plane which is capable of acting upon the whole line simultaneously. Of course, this latter method implies far greater development, since it involves the knowledge of and the power to use forces of a considerable higher level, so that the man who could make his line in this way would not, for his own use, need a line at all, since he could see far more easily and completely by means of an altogether higher faculty. Even the simpler and purely astral operation is a difficult one to describe, though quite an easy one to perform. It may be said to partake somewhat of the nature of the magnetization of a bar of steel, for it consists in what we might call the polarization, by an effort of the human will, of a number of parallel lines of astral atoms reaching from the operator to the scene which he wishes to observe. All the atoms thus affected are held for the time with their axes rigidly parallel to one another, so that they form a kind of temporary tube along which the clairvoyant may look. This method has the disadvantage that the telegraph line is liable to disarrangement or even destruction by any sufficiently strong astral current which happens to cross its path. But if the original effort of will were fairly definite, this would be a contingency of only infrequent occurrence. The view of a distance scene obtained by means of this astral current is in many ways not unlike that seen through a telescope. Human figures usually appear very small, like those on a distant stage, but in spite of their diminutive size, they are as clear as though they were close by. Sometimes it is possible by this means to hear what is said as well as to see what is done. But as in the majority of cases, this does not happen. We must consider it rather as the manifestation of an additional power than as a necessary corollary of the faculty of sight. It will be observed that in this case, the seer does not usually leave his physical body at all. There's no sort of projection of his astral vehicle or of any part of himself towards that at which he is looking, but he simply manufactures for himself a temporary astral telescope. Consequently, he has, to a certain extent, the use of his physical powers even while he is examining the distance seen. For example, his voice would usually still be under his control, so that he could describe what he saw even while he was in the act of making his observations. This consciousness of the man is, in fact, distinctly still at this end of the line. This fact, however, has its limitations as well as its advantages, and these again largely resemble the limitations of the man using a telescope on the physical plane. The experimenter, for example, has no power to shift this point of view. His telescope, so to speak, has a particular field of view which cannot be enlarged or altered. He is looking at his scene from a certain direction, and he cannot suddenly turn it all around and see how it looks from the other side. If he has sufficient psychic energy to spare, he may drop altogether the telescope that he's using and manufacture an entirely new one for himself, which will approach his objective somewhat differently. But this is not a course at all likely to be adopted in practice. But it may be said, the mere fact that he is using astral sight ought to enable him to see it from all sides at once. So it would if he were using that sight in the normal way upon an object which was fairly near him, within his astral reach, as it were. But at a distance of 100 or thousands of miles, the case is very different. Astral sight gives us the advantage of an additional dimension, but there is still such a thing as position in that dimension, and it is naturally a potent factor in limiting the use of the powers of its plane. Our ordinary three-dimensional sight enables us to see at once every point of the interior of a two-dimensional figure, such as a square, but in order to do that, the square must be within a reasonable distance from our eyes. The mere additional dimension will avail a man in London but little in his endeavor to examine a square in Calcutta. Astral sight, when it is cramped by being directed along what is practically a tube, is limited very much as physical sight would be under a similar circumstance. Though if possessed in perfection, it will still continue to show, even at that distance, the auras, and therefore all the emotions and most of the thoughts of the people under observation. There are many people for whom this type of clairvoyance is very much facilitated if they have at hand some physical object which can be used as a starting point for their astral tube, a convenient focus for their willpower. A ball of crystal is the commonest and most effectual of such foci, since it has the additional advantage of possessing within itself qualities which stimulate psychic faculty. But other objects are also employed, to which we shall find it necessary to refer more particularly when we come to consider semi-intentional clairvoyance. In connection with this astral current form of clairvoyance, as with others, we find that there are some psychics who are unable to use it except when under the influence of mesmerism. The peculiarity in this case is that among such psychics there are two varieties. One in which by being thus set free the man is enabled to make a telescope for himself, and another in which the magnetizer himself makes the telescope and the subject is simply enabled to see through it. In this latter case, obviously, the subject has not enough will to form a tube for himself, and the operator, though possessed of the necessary willpower, is not clairvoyant, or he could see through his own tube without needing help. Occasionally, though rarely, the tube which is formed possesses another of the attributes of a telescope, that of magnifying the objects at which it is directed until they seem of life size. Of course, the objects must always be magnified to some extent, or they would be absolutely invisible. But usually the extent is determined by the size of the astral tube and the whole thing is simply a tiny moving picture. In the few cases where the figures are seen as life-size by this method, it is probable that an altogether new power is beginning to dawn. But when this happens, careful observation is needed in order to distinguish them from examples of our next class. 3. By the projection of a thought form. The ability to use this method of clairvoyance implies a development somewhat more advanced than the last, since it necessitates a certain amount of control upon the mental plane. All students of theosophy are aware that thoughts takes form, at any rate upon its own plane, and in the vast majority of cases upon the astral plane also. But it may not be quite so generally known that if a man thinks strongly of himself as present at any given place, the form assumed by that particular thought will be a likeness of the thinker himself, which will appear at the place in question. Essentially, this form must be composed of the matter of the mental plane, but in very many cases it would draw round itself matter of the astral plane also, and so would approach much nearer to visibility. There are in fact many instances in which it has been seen by the person thought of, most probably by means of the unconscious mesmeric influence emanating from the original thinking. None of the consciousness of the thinker would, however, be included within this thought form. When once sent out from him, it would normally be a quite separate entity, not indeed absolutely unconnected with its maker, but practically so far as the possibility of receiving any impression through it is concerned. This third type of clairvoyance consists then in the power to retain so much connection with and so much hold over a newly erected thought form as will render it possible to receive impressions by means of it. Such impressions as were made upon the form would in this case be transmitted to the thinker, not along an astral telegraph line as before, but by sympathetic vibration. In a perfect case of this kind of clairvoyance, it is almost as though the seer projected a part of his consciousness into the thought form and used it as a kind of outpost from which observation was possible. He sees almost as well as he would if he himself stood in the place of his thought form. The figures at which he is looking will appear to him as of life size and close at hand, instead of tiny and at a distance, as in the previous case, and he will find it possible to shift his point of view if he wishes to do so. Clairaudience is perhaps less frequently associated with this type of clairvoyance than with the last, but its place is to some extent taken by a kind of mental perception of thoughts and intentions of those who are seen. Since the man's consciousness is still in the physical body, he will be able, even while exercising the faculty, to hear and to speak, insofar as he can do this without any distraction of his attention. The moment that the intentness of his thought fails, the whole vision is gone, and he will have to construct a fresh thought form before he can resume it. Instances in which this kind of sight is possessed with any degree of perfection by untrained people are naturally rarer than in the case of the previous type because of the capacity for mental control required and the generally finer nature of the forces employed. 4. By traveling in the astral body. We enter here upon an entirely new variety of clairvoyance, in which the consciousness of the seer no longer remains in or closely connected with his physical body, but is definitely transferred to the scene which he is examining. Though it has no doubt greater dangers for the untrained seer than either of the methods previously described, it is yet quite the most satisfactory form of clairvoyance open to him, for the immensely superior variety which we shall consider under our fifth head is not available except for specially trained students. In this case, the man's body is either asleep or in trance, and its organs are consequently not available for use which the vision is going on, so that all description of what is seen and all the questioning as to further particulars must be postponed until the wanderer returns to this plane. On the other hand, the sight is much fuller and more perfect. The man hears as well as sees everything which passes before him, and can move about freely at will within the very wide limits of the astral plane. He can see and study at leisure all the other inhabitants of that plane, so that the great world of the nature spirits, of which the traditional fairyland is but a very small part, lies open before him, and even that of some of the lower devas. He has also the immense advantage of being able to take part, as it were, in the scenes which come before his eyes, of conversing at will with these various astral entities from whom so much information that is curious and interesting may be obtained. If in addition he can learn how to materialize himself, a matter of no great difficulty for him when once the knack is acquired, he will be able to take part in physical events or conversations at a distance and to show himself to an absent friend at will. Again, he has the additional power of being able to hunt about for what he wants by means of the varieties of clairvoyance previously described. For all practical purposes, he could find a person or a place only when he was already acquainted with it, or when he was put en rapport with it by touching something physically connected with it, as in psychometry. It is true that by the third method a certain amount of motion is possible, but the process is a tedious one except for quite short distances. By the use of the astral body, however, a man can move about quite freely and rapidly in any direction, and can, for example, find without difficulty any place pointed out upon a map, without either any previous knowledge of the spot or any object to establish a connection with it. He can also readily rise high into the air so as to gain a bird's eye view of the country which he is examining, so as to observe its extent, the contour of its coastline, or its general character. Indeed, in every way, his power and freedom are far greater when he uses this method than they have been in any of the previous cases. A good example of the full possession of this power is given on the authority of the German writer Jung Stilling by Mrs. Crowe in The Night Side of Nature, page 127. The story is related of a seer who is stated to have resided in the neighborhood of Philadelphia in America. He was grave, benevolent, and pious, and nothing was known against his character except that he had the reputation of possessing some secrets that were considered not altogether lawful. Many extraordinary stories were told of him, and amongst the rest the following. Quote, "The wife of a ship captain, whose husband was on a voyage to Europe and Africa, and from whom she had been long without tidings, being overwhelmed with anxiety for his safety, was induced to address herself to this person. Having listened to her story, he begged her to excuse him for a while when he would bring her the intelligence she required. He then passed into an inner room, and she sat herself down to wait. But his absence continuing longer than she expected, she became impatient, thinking he had forgotten her, and softly approaching the door, she peeped through some aperture, and to her surprise beheld him laying on a sofa, as motionless as if he were dead. She of course did not think it advisable to disturb him, but waited his return. When he told her that her husband had not been able to write to her for such and such reasons, but that he was then in a coffee house in London, and would very shortly be home again. Accordingly he arrived, and as the lady learned from him that the causes of his unusual silence had been precisely those alleged by the man, she felt extremely desirous of ascertaining the truth of the rest of the information. In this she was gratified, for he no sooner set his eyes on the magician than he said that he had seen him before on a certain day in a coffee house in London, and that he told him that his wife was extremely uneasy about him, and that he, the captain, had thereon mentioned how he had been prevented from writing, adding that he was on the eve of embarking for America. He had then lost sight of the stranger amongst the throng, and knew nothing more about him. We have of course no means of knowing what evidence Jung Stilling had of the truth of this story, though he declares himself to have been quite satisfied with the authority on which he relates it. But so many similar things have happened that there is no reason to doubt its accuracy. The seer, however, must either have developed his faculty for himself or learnt it in some school other than that from which most of our theosophical information is derived. For in our case, there is a well understood regulation expressly forbidding the pupils to give any manifestation of such power which can be definitely proved at both ends in that way, and so constitute what is called a phenomenon. That this regulation is emphatically a wise one is proved to all who know anything of the history of our society by the disastrous results which followed from a very slight temporary relaxation of it. I will have given some quite modern cases almost exactly parallel to above in my little book on invisible helpers. An instance of a lady well known to myself, who frequently thus appears to friends at a distance, is given by Mr. Stead in Real Ghost Stories, page 27, and Mr. Andrew Lang gives in his Dreams and Ghosts, page 89, an account of how Mr. Cleve, that at Portsmouth, appeared intentionally on 2 occasions to a young lady in London and alarmed her considerably. There isn't any amount of evidence to be had on the subject by anyone who cares to study it seriously. This paying of intentional astral visits seems very often to become possible when the principles are loosened at the approach of death for people who were unable to perform such a feat at any other time. There are even more examples of this class than of the other. I epitomize a good one given by Mr. Andrew Lang on page 100 of the book last cited, one of which he himself says, "Not many stories have much good evidence in their favor." Mary, the wife of John Goff at Rochester, being afflicted with a long illness, removed to her father's house at West Malling, about 9 miles from her own. The day before her death, she grew very impatiently desirous to see her 2 children, who she had left at home to the care of a nurse. She was too ill to be moved, and between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning she fell into a trance. One widow Turner, who watched with her that night, says that her eyes were open and fixed and her jaw fallen. Mrs. Turner put her hand upon her mouth, but could perceive no breath. She thought her to be in a fit, and doubted whether she were dead or alive. The next morning the dying woman told her mother that she had been at home with her children, saying, "I was with them last night when I was asleep." The nurse at Rochester, widow Alexander by name, affirms that a little before 2 o'clock that morning she saw the likeness of the said Mary Goff come out of the next chamber, where the elder child lay in bed by itself, the door being left open, and stand by her bedside for about a quarter of an hour. The younger child was there lying by her. Her eyes moved and her mouth went, but she said nothing. The nurse, moreover, says that she was perfectly awake. It was then daylight, being one of the longest days in the year. She sat up in bed and looked steadfastly on the apparition. In that time she heard the bridge clock strike 2, and a while after said, "In the name of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what art thou?" Thereupon the apparition removed and went away. She slipped on her clothes and followed, but what became on she cannot tell. The nurse apparently was more frightened by its appearance than its presence, for after this she was afraid to stay in the house, and so spent the rest of the time until 6 o'clock in walking up and down outside. When the neighbors were awake, she told her tale to them, and they of course said she had dreamt it all. She naturally enough warmly repudiated that idea, but could obtain no credence until the news of the other side of the story arrived from West Malling, when people had to admit that there might have been something in it. A noteworthy circumstance in this story is that the mother found it necessary to pass from ordinary sleep into the profounder trance condition before she could consciously visit her children. It can, however, have paralyzed her, and they're among the large number of similar accounts which may be found in the literature of the subject. 2 other stories of precisely the same type, in which a dying mother, earnestly desiring to see her children, falls into a deep sleep, visits them, and returns to say that she has done so, are given by Dr. F.G. Lee. In one of them, the mother, when dying in Egypt, appears to her children at Torquay, and is clearly seen in broad daylight by all 5 of the children and also by the nursemaid. Glimpses of the Supernatural, Volume 2, page 64. In the other, a Quaker lady dying at Cockermouth is clearly seen and recognized in daylight by her 3 children at Settle, the remainder of the story being practically identical with the one given above. Glimpses in the Twilight, page 94. Though these cases appear to be less widely known than that of Mary Goff, the evidence of their authenticity seems to be quite as good, as will be seen by the attestations obtained by the reverend author of the works from which they are quoted. The man who fully possesses this 4th type of clairvoyance has many and great advantages at his disposal, even in addition to those already mentioned. Not only can he visit without trouble or expense all the beautiful and famous places of the earth, but if he happens to be a scholar, think what it must mean to him that he has access to all the libraries of the world. What must it be for the scientifically minded man to see taking place before his eyes so many of the processes of the secret chemistry of nature, or for the philosopher to have revealed to him so much more than ever before of the working of the great mysteries of life and death? To him, those who are gone from this plane are dead no longer, but living and within reach for a long time to come. For him, many of the conceptions of religion are no longer matters of faith, but of knowledge. Above all, he can join the army of invisible helpers and really be of use on a large scale. Undoubtedly, clairvoyance, even when confined to the astral plane, is a great boon to the student. Certainly it has its dangers also, especially for the untrained. Danger from evil entities of various kinds, which may terrify or injure those who allow themselves to lose the courage to face them boldly. Danger of deception of all sorts, of misconceiving and misinterpreting what is seen. Greatest of all, the danger of becoming conceited about the thing and of thinking it impossible to make a mistake. But a little common sense and a little experience should easily guard a man against these. 5. By traveling the mental body. This is simply a higher and, as it were, glorified form of the last type. The vehicle employed is no longer the astral body, but the mind body. A vehicle, therefore, belonging to the mental plane and having within it all the potentialities of the wonderful sense of that plane, so transcendent in its action, yet so impossible to describe. A man functioning in this leaves his astral body behind him along with the physical, and if he wishes to show himself upon the astral plane for any reason, he does not send for his own astral vehicle, but just by a single action of his will materializes one for his temporary need. Such an astral materialization is sometimes called the Mayavi Rupa, and to form it for the first time usually needs the assistance of a qualified master. The enormous advantages given by the possession of this power are the capacity of entering upon all the glory and the beauty of the higher lands of bliss, and the possession, even when working on the astral plane, of the far more comprehensive mental sense which opens up to the student such marvelous vistas of knowledge and practically renders error all but impossible. This higher flight, however, is possible for the trained man only, since only under definite training can a man at this stage of evolution learn to employ his mental body as a vehicle. Before leaving the subject of full and intentional clairvoyance, it may be well to devote a few words to answering 1 or 2 questions as to its limitations, which constantly occur to students. Is it possible, we are often asked, for the seer to find any person with whom he wishes to communicate anywhere in the world, whether he be living or dead? To this, the reply must be a conditional affirmative. Yet, it is possible to find any person if the experiment can, in some way or other, put himself en rapport with that person. It would be hopeless to plunger vaguely into space to find a total stranger among all the millions around us without any kind of clue. But on the other hand, a very slight clue would usually be sufficient. If the clairvoyant knows anything of the man who he seeks, he will have no difficulty in finding him, For every man has what he may be called a kind of musical chord of his own, a chord which is the expression of him as a whole, produced perhaps by a sort of average of the rates of vibration by all his different vehicles on their respective planes. If the operator knows how to discern that chord and to strike it, it will, by sympathetic vibration, attract the attention of the man instantly wherever he may be and will evoke an immediate response from him. Whether the man were living or recently dead would make no difference at all, and clairvoyants of the fifth class could at once find him even among the countless millions in the heaven world, though in that case the man himself would be unconscious that he was under observation. Naturally, a seer whose consciousness did not range higher than the astral plane, who employed therefore one of the earlier methods of seeing, would not be able to find a person upon the mental plane at all. Yet even he would at least be able to tell that the man sought for was upon that plane, from the mere fact that the striking of the chord as far up as the astral level produced no response. If the man sought be a stranger to the seeker, the latter will need something connected with him to act as a clue, a photograph, a letter written by him, an article which has belonged to him and is impregnated with his personal magnetism. Any of these would do in the hands of a practiced seer. Again, I say, it must not therefore be supposed that pupils who have been taught how to use this art are at liberty to set up a kind of intelligence office through which communication can be had with missing or dead relatives. A message given from this side to such an one might or might not be handed on, according to circumstances, but even if it were, no reply might be brought, lest the transaction should partake of the nature of a phenomena, something which could be proved on the physical plane to have been an act of magic. Another question often raised is as to whether, in the action of psychic vision, there is any limitation as to distance. The reply would seem to be that there should be no limit but that of respective planes. It must be remembered that the astral and mental planes of our earth are as definitely its own as its atmosphere, though they extend considerably further from it even in our three-dimensional space than does the physical air. Consequently, the passage to or the detailed sight of other planets would not be possible for any system of clairvoyance connected with these planes. It is quite possible and easy for the man who can raise his consciousness to the Buddhic plane to pass to any other glove belonging to our chain of worlds, but that is outside our present subject. Still, a good deal of additional information about other planets can be obtained by the use of such clairvoyant faculties as we have been describing. It is possible to make sight enormously clear by passing outside of the constant disturbances of the Earth's atmosphere, and it is also not difficult to learn how to put on an exceedingly high magnifying power, so that even by ordinary clairvoyance a good deal of very interesting astronomical knowledge may be gained. But as far as this Earth and its immediate surroundings are concerned, there's practically no limitation. End of chapter. Clairvoyance in space, semi-intentional. Under this rather curious title, I am grouping together the cases of all those people who definitely set themselves to see something, but have no idea what the something will be, and no control over the sight after the visions have begun. Psychic macabre who put themselves into a receptive condition and then simply wait for something to turn up. Many trance mediums would come under this heading. They either in some way hypnotize themselves or are hypnotized by some spirit guide, and then they describe the scenes or persons that happen to float before their vision. Sometimes, however, when in this condition, they see what is taking place at a distance, and so they become to have a place among our clairvoyants in space. But the largest and most widely spread band of these semi-intentional clairvoyants are the various kinds of crystal gazers, those who, as Mr. Andrew Lang puts it, stare into a crystal ball, a cup, a mirror, a bob of ink, Egyptian in India, a drop of blood among the Maoris of New Zealand, a bowl of water, Brit Indian, a pond, Roman and African, water in a glass ball, or almost any polished surface. See Dreams and Ghosts, page 57. 2 pages, Mr. Lang gives us a very good example of the kind of vision most frequently seen in this way. I had given a glass ball, he says, to a young lady, Miss Bailey, who had scarcely any success with it. She lent it to Miss Leslie, who saw a large square, old-fashioned red sofa covered with muslin, which she found in the next country house she visited. Miss Bailey's brother, a young athlete, laughed at these experiments, took the ball into the study, and came back looking gay-gash. He admitted that he had seen a vision, somebody he knew under a lamp. He would discover during the week whether he saw right or not. This was at 5:30 on a Sunday afternoon. On Tuesday, Mr. Bailey was at a dance in town some 40 miles from his home and met a Miss Preston. On Sunday, he said about 5:30, you were sitting under a standard lamp in a dress I never saw you wear, a blue blouse with lace over the shoulders, pouring out a tea for a man in blue serge, whose back was towards me, so that I only saw the tip of his moustache. Why, the blinds must have been up, said Miss Preston. I was at Dolby, said Mr. Bailey, and he undeniably was. This is quite a typical case of crystal gazing. The picture correct in every detail you see, and yet absolutely unimportant and bearing no apparent signification of any sort to either party, except that it served to prove that Mr. Bailey that there was something in crystal gazing. Perhaps more frequently the visions tend to be of a romantic character, men in foreign dress, or beautiful, though generally unknown landscapes. Now, what is the rationale of this kind of clairvoyance? As I have indicated above, it belongs usually to the astral current type, and the crystal or other object simply acts as a focus for the willpower of the seer and a convenient starting point for his astral tube. There are some who can influence what they will see by their will, that is to say, they have the power of pointing their telescope as they wish, but the great majority just form a fortuitous tube and see whatever happens to present itself at the end of it. Sometimes it may be seen comparatively near at hand, and as in the case just quoted, at other times it will be far away, oriental landscape. At others yet, it may be a reflection of some fragment of an Akashic record, and then the picture will contain figures in some antique dress, and the phenomena belongs to our third large division of clairvoyance in time. It is said that visions of the future are sometimes seen in crystals also, a further development to which we must refer later. I have seen a clairvoyant use, instead of the ordinary shining surface, a deal black one, produced by a handful of powdered charcoal in a saucer. Indeed, it does not seem to matter much what is used as a focus, except that pure crystal has an undoubted advantage over some other substance, in that its peculiar arrangement of elemental essence renders it especially stimulating to the psychic faculties. It seems probable, however, that in cases where a tiny brilliant object is employed, such as a point of light or the drop of blood used by the Maoris, the instance is in reality merely one of self-hypnotization. Among non-European nations, the experiment is very frequently preceded or accompanied by magical ceremonies and invocations, so that it is quite likely that such sight as is gained may sometimes be really that of some foreign entity, and so the phenomena may in fact be merely a case of temporary possession and not of clairvoyance at all. End of chapter. Clairvoyance in space, unintentional. Under this heading, we may group together all those cases in which visions of some, even which is taking place at a distance, are seen quite unexpectedly and without any kind of preparation. These are people who are subject to such visions, while there are many others to whom such a thing will happen only once in a lifetime. The visions are of all kinds and of all degrees of completeness, and apparently may be produced by various causes. Sometimes the reason of the vision is obvious and the subject matter of the gravest importance. At other times, no reason at all is discoverable, and the events shown seem of the most trivial nature. Sometimes these glimpses of the superphysical faculty come as waking visions, and sometimes they manifest during sleep as vivid or oft-repeated dreams. In this later case, the site employed and perhaps usually of kind assigned to our fourth subdivision of clairvoyance in space, for the sleeping man often travels in his astral body to some spot with which his affections or interests are closely connected and simply watches what takes place there. In the former, it seems probable that this second type of clairvoyance, by means of the astral current, is called into requisition. But in this case, the current or tube is formed quite unconsciously and is often the automatic result of a strong thought or emotion projected from one end or the other, either from the seer or the person who is seen. The simplest plan will be to give a few instances of the different kinds and to intersperse among them such further explanations as may seem necessary. Mr. Stead has collected a large and varied assortment of recent and well-authenticated cases in his Real Ghost Stories, and I will select some of my examples from them, occasionally condensing slightly to save space. There are cases in which it is at once obvious to any theosophical student that the exceptional instance of clairvoyance was specially brought about by one of the band whom we have called invisible helpers, in order that aid might be rendered to someone in sore need. To this class undoubtedly belongs the story told by Captain Yount of Napa Valley in California. To Dr. Bushnell, who repeats it in his Nature and the Supernatural. About 6 or 7 years previous, in a midwinter's night, he had a dream in which he saw what appeared to be a company of emigrants arrested by the snows of the mountains and perishing rapidly by cold and hunger. He noted the very cast of the scenery, marked by a huge perpendicular front of white rock cliff. He saw the men cutting off what appeared to be treetops rising out of deep gulfs of snow. He distinguished the very features of the persons and the look of their particular distress. He awake profoundly impressed by the distinctness and apparently reality of the dream. He at length fell asleep and dreamed exactly the same dream over again. In the morning, he could not expel it from his mind. Falling in, shortly after which an old hunter comrade, he told his story, and was only the more deeply impressed by his recognizing without hesitation the scenery of the dream. This comrade came over the Sierra by the Carson Valley Pass and declared that a spot in the pass exactly answered his description. By this, the unsophistical patriarch was decided. He immediately called a company of men, with mules and blankets and all necessary provisions. The neighbors were laughing meantime at this credulity. "No matter," he said, "I am able to do this, and I will, for I verily believe the fact that is according to my dream." The men were sent into the mountains 150 miles distant, direct to the Carson Valley Pass, and there they found the company exactly in the condition of the dream, and brought in the remnant alive. Since it is not stated that Captain Yount was in the habit of seeing visions, it seems clear that some helper, observing the forlorn condition of the emigrant party, took the nearest impressionable and otherwise suitable person, who happened to be the captain, to the spot in the astral body, and aroused him sufficiently to fix the scene firmly in his memory. The helper may possibly have arranged an astral current for the captain instead, but the former suggestion is more probable. At any rate, the motive, and broadly the method, of the work are obvious enough in this case. Sometimes the astral current may be set going by a strong emotional thought at the other end of the line, and this may have even though the thinker has no such intention in his mind. In the rather striking story which I am about to quote, it is evident that the link was formed by the doctor's frequent thought about Mrs. Broughton, yet he had clearly no special wish that she should see what he was doing at the time. That it was this kind of clairvoyance that was employed is shown by the 56 of her point of view, which, be it observed, is not the doctor's point of view sympathetically transferred, as it might have been, since she sees his back without recognizing him. The story is to be found in the Proceedings of the Psychical Research Society, Volume 2, page 160. Quote, Mrs. Broughton awoke one night in 1844 and roused her husband, telling him that something dreadful had happened in France. He begged her to go asleep again and not trouble him. She assured him that she was not asleep when she saw what she insisted on telling him, what she saw in fact. First, a carriage accident, which she did not actually see, but what she saw was the result, a broken carriage. A crowd collected, a figure gently raised and carried into the nearest house, then a figure lying on bed which she recognized as the Duke of Orleans. Gradually, friends collecting around the bed, among them several members of the French royalty family, the Queen, then the King, all silently, tearfully watching the evidently dying Duke. One man, she could see his back, but did not know who he was a doctor. He stood behind, over the Duke, feeling his pulse, with his watch in the other hand, and then all passed away, and she saw no more. As soon as it was daylight, she wrote down in her journal all that she had seen. It was before the days of the electric telegraph, and 2 or more days passed before the Times announced the death of the Duke of Orleans. Visiting Paris a short time afterwards, she saw and recognized the place of the accident and received the explanation of her impression. The doctor who attended the dying Duke was an old friend of hers, and as he watched by the bed, his mind had been constantly occupied with her and her family." End quote. A commoner instance is that in which strong affection sets up the necessary current. Probably a fairly steady stream of mutual thought is constantly flowing between the two parties in the case, and some sudden need or dire extremity on the part of one of them ensues this stream temporarily with the polarizing power which is needful to create the astral telescope. An illustrative example is quoted from the same, titled Proceedings, Volume 1, page 30. On September 9, 1848, at the siege of Multan, Major General R.C.B., then adjutant of his regiment, was most severely and dangerously wounded, and supposing himself to be dying, asked one of the officers with him to take the ring off his finger and send it to his wife, who at the time was fully 150 miles distant at Ferozepur. On the night of September 9, 1848, writes his wife, "I was lying on my bed, between sleeping and waking, when I distinctly saw my husband being carried off the field, seriously wounded, and heard his voice saying, 'Take this ring off my finger and send it to my wife.' All the next day I could not get the sight of the voice out of my mind. In due time I heard General R. having been severely wounded in the assault of Multan. He survived, however, and is still living. It was not for some time after the siege that I heard from General L., the officer who helped to carry my husband off the field, and the request as to the ring was actually made by him, just as I heard it at the Ferozepur at the very time. Then there is the very large class of casual clairvoyant visions, which have no traceable cause, which are apparently quite meaningless, and have no recognizable relation to any events known to the seer. To this class belong many of the landscapes seen by some people just before they fall asleep. I quote a capital and very realistic account of an experience of this sort from W.T. Steed's Real Ghost Stories, page 65. "I got into bed, but was not able to go to sleep. I shut my eyes and waited for sleep to come. Instead of sleep, however, there came to me a succession of curiously vivid clairvoyant pictures. There was no light in the room, and it was perfectly dark. I had my eyes shut also, but notwithstanding the darkness, I suddenly was conscious of looking at a scene of singular beauty. It was as if I saw a living miniature about the size of a magic lantern slide. At this moment, I can recall the scene as if I saw it again. It was a seaside piece. The moon was shining upon the water, which rippled slowly to the beach. Right before me, a long mole ran into the water. On either side of the mole, irregular rocks stood up above the sea level. On the shore stood several houses, square and rude, which resembled nothing that I had ever seen in house architecture. No one was stirring, but the moon was there, and the sea and the gleam of the moonlight on the rippling waters, just as if I had been looking on the actual scene. It was so beautiful that I remember thinking that if it continued, I should be so interested in looking at it that I should never go to sleep. I was wide awake, and at the same time that I saw the scene, I distinctly heard the dripping of the rain outside the window. Then suddenly, without any apparently object or reason, the scene changed. The moonlight sea vanished, and in its place I was looking right into the interior of a reading room. It seemed as if it had been used as a schoolroom in the daytime, and was employed as a reading room in the evening. I remember seeing one reader, who had a curious resemblance to Tim Harrington, although it was not he, hold up a magazine or book in his hand and laugh. It was not a picture. It was there. The scene was just as if you were looking through an opera glass. You saw the play of the muscles, the gleaming of the eye, every movement of the unknown persons in the unnamed place into which you were gazing. I saw all that without opening my eyes, nor did my eyes have anything to do with it. You see such things as these, as it were, with another sense, which is more inside your head than in your eyes. This was a very poor and paltry experience, but it enabled me to understand better how it is that clairvoyants see than any amount of disquisition. The pictures were apropos of nothing. They had been suggested by nothing I had been reading or talking of. They simply came as if I had been able to look through a glass at what was occurring somewhere else in the world. I had my peep, and then it passed, nor have I had a recurrence of a similar experience. Mr. Steed regards that as a poor and paltry experience, and it may perhaps be considered so when compared with the greater possibilities. Yet I know many students who would be very thankful to have even so much of direct personal experience to tell, small though it may be in itself. It at once gives the seer a clue to the whole thing, and clairvoyance would be a living actuality to a man who had seen even that much in a way that it could never have been without that little touch with the unseen world. These pictures were much too clear to have been mere reflections of the thoughts of others, and besides, the description unmistakably shows that they were views seen through an astral telescope. So either Mr. Steed must quite unconsciously have set a current going for himself, or, which is much more probable, some kindly astral entity set it in motion for him, and gave him to while away a tedious delay any pictures that happened to come handy at the end of the tube. End of chapter. Before we head over to the next video, please do hit the like button, share this with like-minded people, subscribe to the channel, and yes, leave a comment. Let me know you were here. In the next video, the author is going to talk about clairvoyance, seeing into the past.